Well, thanks everyone for being here. I think the great turnout is a measure of the fact that this is really in many ways the central issue, or one of the central issues of our time, certainly for the United States, but actually across the Western industrialized democracies. And I think we're going to have a great chance to hear both sides of the argument. To make things even more exciting for our panel, we have an imposter here with us. This is our imposter. This is not Nicholas Eberstadt. There you go.
But I slept at a Holiday Inn last night.
But a man who is prepared to make the arguments, and makes the arguments very often in his own right. Doug is going to take the side of why entitlements are really a cancer on the world.
Yes.
Basically, yes.
Yes, gently put, yeah.
Yep.
You better mention his last name for people who don't.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I'm Doug Holtz-Eakin, for those who don't know.
Sorry. Doug Holtz-Eakin, who is writes very often, a leading thinker in the conservative space on these issues.
Thank you.
Fair enough?
Nice.
He really believes this position.
He really believes it. He's not just faking it.
And a former head of the Congressional Budget Office.
And a former head of the Congressional Budget Office, so he actually knows what he's talking about. And then on the other side, and we're going to start with Doug, on the other side we're going to hear from Bill Galston, who is at Brookings right now, also a renowned thinker on these issues. He and Nick have actually written a book that has point counterpoint, which is why we initially set up the debate in this way. And we're going to let Doug start, and then we're going to hear from Bill. Okay.
I am especially delighted to be here today. and I thank you for the indulgence of sitting in for Nick. He would do a much better job. But entitlements are dangerous to America's fiscal soul. They are dangerous to America's economic soul. And the key argument that Nick would like to make is they're also dangerous to our souls, that they are undercutting the moral fiber that made America great. And let me just say briefly a little bit about each of those, and then let Bill make some mistakes. Number one. And for the record, I've known Bill for a long time, and I stand ready to disagree with him in any public space. So this is good. One, entitlements are dangerous to our fiscal soul. This is a no-brainer. If you look at the constellation of entitlement benefits, ranging from Medicare, Medicaid, the new Affordable Care Act, Social Security, welfare, farm programs, and just look across those, the key characteristic is they are rising faster than revenue ever could rise, faster than the economy could ever grow, and they are putting us on an utterly unsustainable course. And in the process, they are doing something very dangerous. The entitlements, so-called mandatory spending, are growing incredibly rapidly, and they are crowding out the annual spending of the Congress. As it turns out, that annual spending, the so-called discretionary accounts, are all the places where we take care of the future. Those are the places where we fund national defense and our security for the future. Those are the places where we do basic research, infrastructure, education. And so we are literally, as a matter of budgetary arithmetic, allowing the legacy programs of the past crowd out our future. And it is fundamentally dangerous to our budgetary future. It spills over to the fact that they are the source of the enormous red ink that everyone in this crowd is probably familiar with. We have seen debt in the United States go from about 35% of GDP up to 70% of GDP. And if we don't change these entitlements, it will go ever northward. And it is only a matter of time. It is not a question of if that we will have a sovereign debt crisis of a Greek, Portugal, Ireland style if we continue on that trajectory. The only fight is about when it hits. It will hit. And so it is fundamentally dangerous to our economic soul. We are passing to the next generation a broken budget and a broken economy. And that's an immoral thing to do, which brings us to the third part of this argument, which is that we stay on this trajectory in a regular fashion and don't change because we have become a nation of slackers, a nation that has lost the willingness to go and create greatness on our own. We are dependent and seduced by the ease of the welfare state, and we are harming America's future, not just in a budgetary and economic sense, but in a deep moral sense. We have sapped ourselves of what made ourselves great.
Okay. Bill, nation of slackers soon to become Greece, Portugal, and Ireland. Discuss.
Well, I find myself, I must confess, in a peculiar position because I disagree less with the facts that Doug has put on the table than with some of the implications, especially the moral implications that the fellow he's substituting for has drawn from them. I don't think there is a lot of debate among people who know the facts about the trajectory that we're on. It is worth noting that we are now on a track that will stabilize the debt to GDP ratio over roughly the next decade. That doesn't mean we've solved the problem. We've postponed the problem, and in my judgment, we've postponed the problem in a very bad way by gutting precisely the discretionary domestic accounts that are responsible for the future. And so, thus far, I think no real disagreement. We may have a disagreement 10 years from now as to how to solve this problem. And for
the record, he's wrong already.
We can get into that in a minute. Cold fire.
And there is a question on the table as to whether, as to the balance between enhanced funding for these programs and diminished benefits from these programs. That's an economic argument, it's a political argument to some extent, it's a moral argument that needs to be joined. Simply saying that there's a gap between revenues and and funds flowing out from these programs is not necessarily a decisive argument that the programs need to be slashed or gutted. We need to talk about how to respond to this problem, but that there is a problem is not in dispute between us. What may be in dispute is the sources of the problem. And so let me review the bidding very quickly. First of all, we are an aging society. And that has implications for the way we do business, not just as a society, but as a government. We have committed ourselves to a certain range of securities and guarantees for people in their retirement years. People have relied on those guarantees, and to be frank, it's very difficult for me to say, based on other trends that I'll talk about in a minute, that we could really double back entirely on those commitments. So that's fact number one, an aging society and the programmatic and fiscal implications of an aging society. And when you add to that the fact that there has been a near disappearance of defined benefit pensions and retiree health care, the implications for public provision are profound, and this is a structural problem that is not going to change anytime soon. Second, I would point out with regard to programs that don't address retirees, but the needs of people in their working years as well as children, there are some economic facts that help explain why we're in this situation. Let me just list a few of them. There's been a profound change in the distribution of income in the United States. The top 1% has broken away. We all know that. The percentage of the national product going to labor has declined. The percentage going to capital has increased. There's been wage stagnation in the middle of the spectrum and wage declines at the bottom. Believe it or not, median household income is now 6% below where it was in 1999. There's some real problems out there, and some of these programs are responding to that. And then we have the lingering effects of the Great Recession. And here are a few things to know about that. Nearly half of the new college graduates who have jobs are underemployed. That is to say, they're doing jobs that don't require the academic qualifications that they've spent so much time and money gaining. Here's another thing to keep in mind. When the unemployed find new jobs, more than half of them are now holding jobs paying less than the jobs they had before they lost their jobs during the Great Recession. Here's a third thing to keep in mind that will help frame this debate. The number of Americans in poverty is up by 10 million. 10 million since 2007. It's up by 14 million since 1999. The poverty rate in America has gone up from 12 to 15%. Among children, it's now about 21%. These are some of the background facts that are driving the outlays that are creating the fiscal discussion. And so the question, it seems to me, is how we put together the fiscal concerns that Doug has articulated with the human realities that I've just put on the table. Can we square that circle? That question is going to demand the best, most open-minded thinking that America has to offer, and maybe we can begin that today.
Okay, so Bill has done kind of a jujitsu. He's not disagreeing with the facts you're presenting.
How can
but
I?
he's
He has
saying,
a long track record of being slippery. I'm ready.
There you go. So he's basically saying that, old people, young
Right.
people, poor people, what are you going to propose?
So-
What do you want to do with them?
So a detail. I think Bill overstates the amount of time we have. The notion that we have a decade that things will be fine. The numbers show us stabilizing debt to GDP roughly through 2016, maybe 17, a very politically convenient fact. And then they go north. And the reality is we don't have from now to 2023. We have a lot less time. The second reason we have
Can I
less
ask
time.
you to just talk about less time, because I think that's a good point.
I think this is very
to-
important. Think about Social Security reform. First of all, we absolutely have to have it. Right now, Social Security is kept solvent on the government books. The actuary can sign, the trustees can sign, they can issue reports, only because we are promising to cut benefits 25% across the board to those in retirement in 20 years. So we are already planning to gut in the Social Security program. The only question now is, are we going to do something more sensible? That's a ridiculous way to run a pension system, and no private entity could get away with it. So we do need to fix it, and it has been a tradition when fixing it that we grandfather those who are in or near retirement. Indeed, the magic age is 55 years old. By that metric, it's already too late. I turned 55 on February 3rd. I'm the trailing edge of the baby boom generation, the aging that Bill mentioned. If you grandfather me, you grandfather the problem. And it's already too late in Social Security. And so there's an urgency here that I think you cannot dismiss by saying, hey, we got a decade to sort of sort this out. We don't. Right now, Medicare has a gap between payroll taxes and premiums coming in, spending going out, of $300 billion a year. It is alone responsible for a third of these $1 trillion deficits. It is alone responsible for a quarter of all federal debt outstanding since 2000. It is a system that is going to fall under its own financial weight, which is a disgrace to future beneficiaries, and it delivers bad health care, okay? So there should be no complacency. Medicaid's even worse. Medicaid beneficiaries show up at emergency rooms at 3 times the rate of those who are uninsured. Now, there's a great insurance program. Send people to the ER for normal care instead of seeing a primary care physician. None of these programs make sense, and to defend them as something that we need to keep or expand and perhaps fund with more revenue misses the point that they are fundamentally dangerous to Americans.
Can you, Bill, comment on we have the 10-year period as a start?
Very briefly. First of all, I was basing my comments about the next 10 years on figures produced by one of Doug's able successors at CBO. And the fact of the matter is, as on the track that we're now on, the debt to GDP ratio 10 years from now will be roughly where it is now. I'm pretty sure about that, Doug. Now, did I say that we should squander those 10 years? I did not. Okay? And as a matter of fact, I'm as much opposed to complacency on this score as you are. We have some room to maneuver, and we had better not waste it. And I have to say right now, we may well be on track to wasting it, and that distresses me as much as it distresses you. Now, with regard to Social Security, you and I have both studied this problem for a long time. You and I think, would both agree that there are some perfectly sensible, non-apocalyptic fixes to the system that could bring it into 75-year balance without sweating too hard. And if we were...
What are those? Do you want to give us the top 3?
Well, tell you what, Will you accept 2?
Yes.
Okay. Thing number one, point number one, a fellow by the name of Bob Posen some years ago proposed a system called progressive indexation. And what that means is that benefits for people, roughly speaking, below the median income would continue to be tailored to the growth not of inflation, but of wages. And wages typically grow somewhat faster than the underlying rate of inflation. That is to say, typically real wages go up a bit. Now, that typical formula hasn't been much in evidence recently, and the gap between the consumer price index and the wage index has been next to nil, which is part of the distress that so many American workers are now feeling. But in the long run, we would expect that gap to open up. And then as you proceed from the middle to the top, the indexation formula would be shifted downward to focus increasingly on wages, on CPI, the Consumer Price Index, as opposed to wages. That would have the effect of ratcheting down benefits in a progressive fashion. So I would say, without fear of contradiction, that virtually everybody in this room who's not now on Social Security will get a smaller benefit as the result of this than you would expect otherwise. Here's a second point. The system was initially designed for a tax base of roughly 90% of total American wages. Because of the increasing dispersion of wages, the breakaway of the 1%, more and more of the income that isn't taxed is more and more income is above the cap. And so what we have now is a wage base for the Social Security system of about 85% of wages. Over a 10-year period, you could close that gap between 85 and 90%. And so with reasonable progressive cuts on the benefit side and a reasonable expansion on the revenue side, you could go a long way towards achieving the 75-year balance in the Social Security program. Now, we can have a debate as to whether you want to proceed down that road or something more structural. I think I know where I stand, and I've changed my mind on that over the past 10 years, in part in response to the vagaries of the stock market. The more we make Social Security like a private account, the more uncertain it becomes. And in an increasingly uncertain economy, I think we need a small island of certainty for America's families.
So you've moved away from the private account
I
more
have.
towards the kind of system you're describing now.
I have.
Okay, Doug,
So-
has Bill just rescued Social Security for us in about 4 minutes?
In the interest of comedy, I mean, we do agree on this to a great extent. We've both done this a long, long time.
It's okay to agree and
there
come
are-
up with a plan.
There are 5 or 6 plans that have been proposed over the years that have the following basic elements in architecture. Number one, you raise the minimum benefit, which is too low.
Right.
And that needs to be recognized. Number two, you fix the system for a whole series of inequities that arise because of the changing demographics, divorce rates in particular, and two-earner couples, and there's a lot of things that are legacies of the startup that don't fit modern demography. You fix those. That's not a big budgetary item, but it's a fairness issue that ought to be addressed. Third thing you do is you somehow give the more affluent, who made the most on a lifetime basis, less in the way of benefits. Not
Do
less
you
than people
tax
are getting
them
now.
more? Do you tax them
Let me
more,
finish,
as
let me
Bill
finish,
has-
Let me finish. So you always do something like Posen, or you just change the benefit form. You do something at the upper end. And it's important to recognize that people will still get more than current retirees get. They just get less than they are ostensibly promised. But I remind you, everyone's going to get whacked 25%. So this is actually, if you look at it on an apples-to-apples comparison, a perfectly generous deal to come out of. And then the third thing is you deal with the revenue side. And there are a variety of different proposals on the revenue side, raise the rate, things like that. The one Bill's described is the one I'm actually most supportive of, which is just keep the rates the same, have a bigger wage base. The truth is, I am sufficiently, and the last thing I would say is I'm out of step with many conservatives in that I have never thought we should do private accounts of Social Security. It is the last defined benefit pension system in America. The great private sector experiment with DB plans is over, and we're just cleaning up the mess. So if you want to have a defined benefit plank, it's got to be Social Security. And so I've thought, I'm sufficiently distressed with the outlook and our utterly disgraceful management of this pension program that I would pick out of a hat any one of the 6 and take it if they would just do it. That's where I am on Social Security.
Okay, so we are utterly failing in our mission of
No,
a
we're not done.
polarized
I'm ready.
debate.
I'm ready.
But I think Washington does a good job on that. And I'm finding it quite comforting to discover that there is some really sensible ground in the middle on fixing Social Security.
Can
Are
I
there
say,
any
though-
points of sharp disagreement
I
on
do-
Social Security you guys want to
No, I
come
want to put
to?
Social Security aside, but I want to
So,
go
okay,
back to...
have we agreed on Social Security?
In principle, yes, and the problem is that Social Security is the easiest problem. we
Yeah,
have to
now we're going to
discuss.
fight.
Now we're gonna fight.
Now, if you guys could get leading Democrats, leading Republicans in a room, would you find this same widespread agreement? Is this where all sensible people on
This-
your teams generally want to go?
Now we're going to fight. This is the left's fault. This could be done. But they have drawn this line that says we're not touching entitlements. The president put out this thing called, in his budget this year that it wasn't even Social Security reform, but it did touch Social Security, and they exploded. The Democrats exploded in Capitol, said this is an utter betrayal. There's no way we're doing this. And they have just drawn this. They are not going to do it. And indeed, for a decade, there was this Mexican standoff where Republicans said, we're not raising taxes unless you cut entitlements. Democrats were saying, we're not cutting entitlements unless you raise taxes. They stared at each other for a decade. The taxes have happened, and the Democrats still won't cut the entitlements. So, I want Bill to defend that.
Bill, can you defend it?
Well, I have a deal for you, Doug. If you work on your friends about revenues into the system, I'll work on my friends about benefits. Because
You just got $600 billion. Show me a good faith effort to do something.
we're talking about Social Security now, Doug. We're talking about a discussion that should have occurred in the context of Social Security reform, has not, and I would submit to you that if we both got a representative sample of our friends in the same room, you would find many of your friends disagreeing with you, and I'd find many of my friends disagreeing with me, and then we'd have to work on our respective sides.
I have a polarizing track record. Yes, I know.
All right. Fair enough.
Here's the other thing that I think is tragic about the drawing the line on fixing Social Security. It's the thing we should have done first to send the right signal to world capital markets that we can get our fiscal house in order. I mean, we are playing with fire. Yes, we're the United States, but we're not immune from the laws of arithmetic or economics, and our debt is out of control. Had we reformed Social Security, we would have said to world capital markets, we have the capacity to touch the traditional third rail of politics. We can take some, not by no means not all, of the pressure out of the unsustainability, and it would have had zero near-term so-called austerity effects. That debate would have just been missed entirely because all of the impacts happen after about 10 years. And so, I'm still going to blame your guys for not getting this done, and I wish we had.
Okay, and I suspect I'm not going to get much argument out of Bill, out of the desirability to have solved this yesterday.
Look, I'm sorry to be disappointing you as the moderator and you all as the audience, but I too believe that Social Security is much more fixable than any of the problems we're going to spend this hour talking about, and that with leadership on both sides, this issue could have been behind us. And it could have been done outside the divisive framework of the fiscal challenge. It could have been done in its own box. And it wasn't, and it may be too late to do it within its own box, and I regret that.
Okay, let's get to the hard stuff.
So I think Bill's opening remarks made the case for why we should change the entitlements. Because what he said was, look, we've got all this wage stagnation and the take-home pay is not rising. Why is that? It's because of the entitlements. The out-of-control health care spending, Medicare and Medicaid, which drives the cost of health care in the United States, are the reason that private sector health insurance is going up, and that's why there's no take-home pay. It's all the increases in compensation are getting chewed up by health care. And so if you went and fixed Medicare, the very first thing you should do in healthcare reform, not the last, you can take some of the pressure off take-home pay, and we won't have the declining median incomes that he worries about. If you look at the number of people who are underemployed and unemployed, again, the entitlement system drives it. It has terrible work incentives. Think of the one that's supposed to be a good idea called unemployment insurance. How does unemployment insurance work? In a nation that prides itself on a dynamic economy where there will be, especially early in careers, short spells of unemployment as you move from job to job and climb the traditional ladder, does it say prepare yourself for unemployment for a spell of unemployment? Does it give you any reason to anticipate it? No. Unemployment happens, and then it says, hey, why don't you just hang out for 2 weeks before you qualify? And then once you're on unemployment insurance, we'll give you more the longer you stay unemployed. And the evidence is unambiguous that people stay unemployed for longer periods of time. So terrible work incentives, nothing to anticipate, and bad incentives after that. And the more people are unemployed, the worse their skills are, and then they tend to disappear. That's just one.
I'm just going
And
to pause you there
the
because I
list
think
can go
medical
on.
care is a big one, which you've started to tackle.
Yep.
And I'm going to ask Bill, first of all, do you agree with Doug's assertion that median wage stagnation is because of health care?
Not entirely, because there's a question as to how technical we want to get in this discussion.
You seem like very smart people,
yes,
so
I
think
know,
you can begin.
but it can also get quite tedious. And the last thing I want to be is tedious. If you look at other indices of total compensation, which includes fringe benefits, principally health care, as well as wages, total compensation for median households has largely stagnated as well. It hasn't stagnated to the same extent that just looking at money wages has, but it has fallen far short of the productivity increases in the economy, which was not the case in the previous period of the post-war world. And as proof positive of that, I think the macro statistics about the division of national product as between labor and capital don't lie, because the labor share includes the benefits. So I don't accept the proposition that if we simply looked at total compensation, we'd be driven to a different conclusion, nor do I accept the proposition that if we simply fix healthcare, all will be well on the wage front. So those are just going to have to be points of disagreement. I'm not sure how much farther we can go
We'll just disagree.
without descending into
I
the
like these
analytical
people too much
weeds.
to counter.
Exactly. So
Now, on healthcare specifically,
on healthcare specifically. Okay.
is Doug right that this is a huge entitlement issue that needs to be fixed? And has the Affordable Care Act fixed it or made it worse?
I have no idea whether and nobody else does either, right? Anytime you hear someone confidently predicting what the 10-year impact of the implementation of the Affordable Care Act is going to be, you know for sure that person doesn't know what he or she is talking about, right? This is such.
Or is a journalist?
This is such a, or is a journalist's source forced to utter 2 clear sentences on deadline. I speak from bitter experience, and it's bought me nothing but trouble. Here, let me take off the fiscal hat for just a minute and put on a slightly broader hat, if I may. If you look at modernity, if you look at the hundreds of years since people like Descartes began talking about this profound change in human existence, one of the principal promises on the table that science and technology could make human life, not only could it make human life progressively better, more prosperous, more comfortable, but also you could push back the frontiers of disease and even death. Descartes goes so far as to talk about immortality through the perfection of medical science. 300 years ago, the assumption was that immortality was for the next life, not for this life. There has been a profound change of consciousness that we are all a part of. As Aristotle pointed out, the desire for life is infinite. So is the fear of death. The healthcare system is the place where our desire for endless life and our fear of death comes to a head. And in principle, there is no limit to the amount of spending that we would like to see in that area and the level of healthcare services that we would like to see. We are all in the same boat, and it is very difficult to have honest public discussions about limits to the power to extend life and to push death and disease back. This is not just a fiscal problem. This is a social, moral, and even philosophical challenge for all modern societies. We now, in principle, have competences to do things that we all want to have done for ourselves, for those near and dear to us and for society as a whole, but which in the aggregate we cannot afford to do. We are lousy at making judgments on matters of health and disease, life and death, and our healthcare system is constructed very poorly to help us make those decisions. This is not a technical question, right? And we can talk about technical fixes, but the background is much deeper than that. And and I would be the first to admit that a system that allows us to consume as much as we want and to offload the costs onto invisible others is probably the worst of all possible systems. And that's where we are now. And those incentives need to be fixed, or at least improved. But underlying all of that is, as I said, not a technical question of incentives. It's much more a question of what our expectations as a society are, and those expectations are limitless.
And isn't it also, Bill, a question of who decides? And what's your answer to that?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because the idea of consumer sovereignty, which is part of many conservative proposals, assumes a level of consumer knowledge that in many cases doesn't exist. It assumes a level of information about the effectiveness of certain choices that is not widely available even to experts, let alone to consumers. And so, example, an expert panel may find that the newfangled drug is no more effective than the older drug, which may by now be generic, or it may find that the new drug is 5 times as expensive and only 5% more effective. Now, how is that fact to be made effective in our healthcare system? Is that simply a matter of consumer sovereignty, or is there room for a board of experts with some influence over the availability of those choices and the way they're presented to people?
A death panel, perhaps?
Well, something called IPAB, which I think is a defensible addition to the healthcare system, but every conservative I know rejects on principle. Your turn, Doug.
A lot of material there. First, I 100% concur with the notion that this is the hardest and most important of our domestic policy issues, indeed all of our national issues, because its impact on national security means it's the most important thing we face, and that it has all of the dimensions Bill described with the moral decision-making at the core. And that's exactly right. And for that reason, I have always favored and believe there is simply no substitute for reforms that place the financial resources in the same place the moral authority resides, and that's in the family. It will not be the case that Americans are going to let these crucial decisions be made by HMOs. Been there, done that, not happening. They're not going to be made by any insurance company. We're not going to have some IPAB or other set of government bureaucrats happily make these choices. They're going to be made by families in the way that they have been made for centuries. Will those families find trusted advisors? You betcha. They don't know everything they need to on this stuff. And they will go seek out doctors, relatives, medical experts that they need to consult. And the access to better information for those trusted experts can be improved. But I'll point out that if you control the dollars, not just the services come to you, so does the information. And we have failed to take advantage of that in healthcare in the United States for a long time. Information's not free. It costs money to know what the prices of things are. It costs money to know the contents of what they are. And we deliver that information in other parts of our economy very effectively because the person paying it for it wants to know. We can do that in healthcare. And so we should reform these to get out of this entitlement system where an unknown other is paying the bill, and even worse, an unknown other may now make the decision and put the system on something that has financial resources of the family. That's sort of point one. Now, where do these resources come from? I reject utterly the basic notion that's embedded in the Affordable Care Act and Medicare that Americans shouldn't pay for their own health insurance. If you listen to the folks who advocated for these programs talk, sometimes we talk about raising the age of eligibility for Medicare. First thing they scream is, you're just shifting costs to the private sector. They're going to have to pay their own bill. What's wrong with that? Why, if I want to have a gold-plated health insurance or less expensive health insurance, why isn't that something that we as Americans are responsible for doing on our own? Why is there a presumption that an insurance product, this isn't care, this isn't the catheter that keeps me alive, this is a financial product that
If a
says...
catheter is keeping you alive, you're in really bad shape. I'd like to know what your disease is.
My heart catheterization. No, I mean, that's wrong. I mean, we need to rethink that. And so for those who can afford it, man, they should be paying for it. And there will be those who need financial help. America has a long tradition of progressive public sectors. We take care of poor people in an utterly desirable and noble fashion, and we'll do it in healthcare as well. But we're not,
Who
the system we
decides
have.
how much health care poor people get?
Look, this is going to be driven by basic budget economics because we can't hand out all the money that people want. So that's that. And we'll decide it the way we always do in democracies. We'll vote.
So it's okay if poor people
But I think
die
the
sooner?
structure...
It's okay for death to be the penalty of poverty?
Death is the penalty of poverty right now. And so you look at the data, people live longer if they're more affluent. They have better health. There's no question about that. That's another reason why I'd sure like to see these programs start quashing the average American's ability to work, earn a living, and see their income go up.
I have two comments. First of all, I'm not an economist. I think you are. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Why the hesitation?
Yeah.
It's a trick question, I know it.
Yeah,
Been there, done that.
okay. As an economist, would you agree to the following proposition? That information is often a public good that will be undersupplied by the private market.
Yes.
Okay. Then there may very well be a role for the government in the generation and provision of information about healthcare.
No question about that.
Okay, so
I have a fix for that, by the way.
Yeah.
And you're about to go in the wrong direction. Go ahead.
Well, I'm even about to go in the wrong direction. Although we have taken 3 steps down the road together, I'll bet you that. And so, for example, the idea of government involvement in efficacy testing or cost-benefit analysis testing for, let us say, new drugs versus existing drugs is not in principle distasteful to you.
I don't want to know why the government has to do it. Why can't the government be the Consumer Reports fair arbiter? We say this, a private drug company, for example, has every incentive to show that they are a good value proposition.
Oh, so
that they're effective.
So information is a private good after all.
So no, hear me out.
All right.
So they should conduct clinical trials that show not just safety, but efficacy, and we know the cost, and there's a role for it could be a not-for-profit, but you could put it in the government that says, they've supplied us this information. We agree that these trials were done in a scientifically rigorous fashion. These are good data. Here you go. You know the costs, you now know the benefits. Anybody can bring this data to the board, and we now have lots of information publicly available. But the government doesn't have to do everything, and it doesn't do a very good job when it does.
Regrettably, and we may disagree here, private firms don't always do a very good job either.
They don't have any incentive to it. They have no incentive to at the moment.
I'd like to let Bill.
Let me give
Yeah,
you.
go ahead.
Let me give you an example. If you are a private firm and you have funded a series of tests, you are under no legal obligation to release the results of the tests that don't go in the direction you want. And there are lots and lots and lots of examples of cherry picking of the data because there is a private incentive to do exactly that. But I think we've agreed on the basics. That is that if information is critical to a more market-based system, but information is to some extent a public good, then there is a public role in the information system at the very least. Do we agree on that? Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Number 2.
But that doesn't look anything like what that's not IPAB. Why would you want to have IPAB?
Well, I think we disagree as to what IPAB is, but that's a different matter. Number 2. It sounds to me as though you're in favor of something like the following system, that that consumer sovereignty ought to rule, but that some households are not going to be able to exercise that sovereign power effectively because they lack the resources. And therefore, on a progressive basis, there is a public role for providing the resources to those households so they can exercise a private choice. Is that correct?
As in the rest of the economy.
Okay, so something like the system of the Federal Employee Health Benefit Program, where there's a certain amount provided to employees, and then above that amount, if they want a plan that's more expensive than they can buy with what's provided to them, that's their business and not their employer's business.
Right.
Okay. Well, what we've just talked about is not all that different from the subsidy structure of the Affordable Care Act.
It's very different. And this is. I mean, I know it was rude to interrupt, but that's what I am. At the core, if you go back to my critique of your comments, the Affordable Care Act has very high taxes on low-income people who seek to work because you cut their subsidies for every dollar that they make. And you layer that onto similar impacts from the Earned Income Tax Credit and a variety of other of your favorite entitlement programs, and what you produce are marginal tax rates for low-income Americans that are 60 and 70% in some cases, higher. The ACA has some cliffs where they're literally infinite if you do the math. It's a terrible program because it destroys work incentives at the same time that it attempts to provide these subsidies. My system won't do that. And what have we done as a nation? We haven't done anything other than say, well, then you shouldn't have to work. Fine, don't work. That's a terrible outcome. We don't fix the Affordable Care Act by making food stamps more generous and by making TANF more generous and making unemployment benefits last for 2 years. Fix these programs. They're killing us.
Okay, let me, if I may.
Yes, and then I want to get to unemployment insurance because our time is running out.
Okay.
So.
Is there going to be time for audience engagement? If so, we're already well past it.
So answer yours and give you guys each one unemployment insurance moment, and then we'll get more questions.
I think we're just going to let UI, unemployment insurance, sit where Doug left it because the literature on the subject is vast, and I don't want to go there. We chew up the remaining time. Okay, let's talk about one of the programs that Doug just put on the table, the Earned Income Tax Credit. A program that, and I'm not saying this proves it's a good program, a program that has enjoyed bipartisan support since it was inaugurated, I believe, in the Ford administration. The basic idea of the Earned Income Tax Credit is that if your earnings, your market wages are below a certain point, you will receive a public subsidy which peaks and then declines past a certain point. So it sort of looks like an odd sort of trapezoid where it goes like this, and then there's level subsidies, and then it heads down like that. And Doug is talking about the alleged work incentives of the line that goes down like this. I am unaware, and no doubt I'll be instructed, of any any serious studies that demonstrate that the Earned Income Tax Credit, this wage supplement for low and modest income workers, has a negative effect on work incentives. I know of no such studies. It's worth talking about, but the argument that if subsidies are being cut like this, that somehow people will move back on work, and retreat from work or cut down their work simply because some abstract cost-benefit analysis suggests that they ought to, I think is not consistent with the way human beings in this economy actually behave.
Okay,
So
hold fire.
no.
We have to let these fine people ask you questions, and then you can get your little sneaky reply in there. Okay, so please have at it. And if you want both of our debaters to answer, please say that. And if you want to direct your questions at one particular person, please say that too. Do we want people to come up to the mic? Is that how we need to do it?
Yes, we don't have another interview.
Okay, so sorry about that. Do you mind coming up to the mic, please? I think.
Okay, I think roving will work better.
Yeah.
It'll complicate the camera work, but that's their problem.
What will our local, state, and federal government do about the unfunded liabilities they have, which are over 4 times our national debt? They are promises to government employees over time. They total now over $60 trillion. And why doesn't the government put them on their balance sheet like they forced companies to put them on their balance sheet?
Okay, Bill, I'm going to let you go first.
Thanks,
a brand new problem.
Thanks a lot.
Sorry. Sorry about that.
Look, I mean, let me be blunt. A lot of states have made promises to public employees that they have not funded. And it's coming out in the wash. As a matter of fact, there was a new study that just came out yesterday to the effect that if you look at state pension programs as a whole, they're funded to only 48% of liabilities. That's down from 72% of a previous study. Whatever the right number is, it's huge, and you're right. And I confidently predict that the states are not going to be able to honor 100 cents on the dollar of the pension promises they've made, and it's a political and legal question how they're going to be able to walk those back, but I can't argue with your facts.
Okay, I suspect Doug's going to agree with you there.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, we went through this territory when I was at the CBO, and it's as a matter of what should be recorded on the government's balance sheet. It's important to recognize that these are not, in fact, legal liabilities of the federal government. The Supreme Court has ruled, for example, that we can change Social Security benefits. So they don't have the same legal status that the pension funds do, for example, which are a legal obligation of the
Sometimes
states.
in some states constitutional.
And some, it's even worse there.
It's
yes.
even worse, right.
So I am allergic to the term unfunded liability in a federal context because, number one, they're not really liabilities. They're policy decisions that we need to rethink. And number two, by calling them unfunded, it invites you to fund them, and we can't.
Pretty bad news for anyone who's counting on that money, though. Okay, please.
Hello.
And then we'll bring the mic back.
You spend a lot of time on healthcare. Nothing was mentioned about untold billions and billions of dollars going to 3 areas. One is big pharma, including durable medical equipment. 2, the health insurance companies. 3, hospitals. And if any of you have ever been hospitalized, you see bills that are absolutely insane. They're all pie-in-the-sky bills, and they shift things over. They use cost shifting and say, well, we take care of the indigent, or we do some research, and therefore we can charge $500 for an aspirin. Those 3 enormous entities have tremendous political clout, tremendous lobbying power in Congress, and these major cost drivers, it all gets suppressed in the discussion. It wasn't even brought up. And the Congress tends to say nothing because they're controlled by that. Is there anything done that can be done in the regulatory area to limit and control these costs?
Okay, Doug, I'll let you go first. I'm calling this the Steve Brill problem.
Yes, exactly.
First of all, I think you've got it exactly right in terms of the political economy of this. I mean, if you look at the Affordable Care Act, the hospitals carved out all sorts of special provisions for themselves. I think the fundamental focus needs to be on the care problem. Insurance is how you shift the cost of care from one person to another, but our healthcare costs too much. Hospitals, docs, and other providers are at the heart of that, including the pharmaceuticals. And it would be my hope that we'd actually undertake a serious reform of the delivery system that would actually rein that in. Now, since this is about entitlements, I do believe deeply that the biggest cost shifting in the healthcare system is due to the entitlement programs. Medicare pays about 70 cents on the dollar. Medicaid pays about 56 cents on the dollar. Enormous costs get shifted to private payers who then start doing hot potato and trying to stick it any place they can. That's a big problem. And the other thing is that Medicare itself drives bad medicine in America. And if you think of Medicare, think of it this way. It's got Part A that pays hospitals, Part B that pays doctors, Part C that pays some insurance companies, Part D that pays drug companies. So we've just rounded up, it's like Casablanca, we just rounded up the suspects. But if you look at that structure, it guarantees they get paid, but there's no beneficiary in there anywhere. There's nothing that says do a coordinated comprehensive care program that keeps the person from getting sick to begin with or provides high quality outcomes. It rewards volume and fee for service. The entitlement program is driving bad medicine in America, and it's paying those guys in the process.
Let me just make one other point. A couple of years ago, I read a McKinsey study that compared the U.S. healthcare system to a number of systems in Europe and the so-called OECD countries. And one thing jumps out at you. Compensation in the U.S. healthcare system is way out of whack with compensation for doctors and other healthcare professionals and insurance executives anywhere else in the known universe. And so we talk about expectations that average citizens have. Well, what about the expectations of providers who are getting twice or even 3 times as much in the United States as they do in other, I think, quite civilized countries where they're not starving in the streets? Right? So we have to ask ourselves, and I'm sorry if there are any high-paid healthcare professionals in the audience, because you no doubt feel that you've worked very hard for what you've gotten, but people in other countries work just as hard for half or a third of what you're getting, and we have to take that into account somehow.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions, please, ma'am, and then up here.
So Colorado has the fastest growing rate of child poverty in the nation, which most people don't realize. So I'm particularly concerned about entitlement programs that impact kids and the poor in our state. There's been a lot of discussion today about kind of the big chunks of Social Security, Medicaid, health, and those kind of things. We haven't really talked about specific programs like the food stamp program, which in the last election and with the Farm Bill have been all over the place and been very villainized. How do you think we kind of reshape that narrative about what's really driving debt when the programs that serve specifically low-income folks tend to be the ones that are villainized?
Okay.
Well, I'll let the
villainizer
go
defend
first.
himself first.
So let me say 2 things. First, stepping back, it would be my dream for the U.S. to rethink its entitlement notions in the following way. We entitle old people and retirees to an extraordinary degree. We should be entitling the young and entitling them more deeply with their education and their saving capacity so that they can pay for their own old age. When we have it backwards. By having it backwards and letting those dollars crush these programs, we're having a series of pointless, I think, skirmishes and brush fires that are over the income distribution. And those are going to fail. This is going to be like a land war in Asia. I mean, there is no way we will fix the income distribution problem with a combination of budget-starved low-income programs and our tax code. We need to fix the old age entitlement problems, or we're not going to stand a chance.
Am I right to suspect you're going to largely agree with what Doug just said?
Well, since this may very well turn out to be the last question after all.
We'll let
Yeah.
Constance ask.
Okay, fair enough. But let me just expand on that, because Doug said something almost an hour ago that I really agree with, and I think if anything, it needs to be underscored. The current federal budget is shifting resources to the past and the present while starving the future. That should worry every one of us. What we're talking about is a federal budget that reflects the profoundest generational selfishness in our country's history, right? And here, let me quote a conservative, a noted conservative, Edmund Burke, that a society is in fact a compact between past, present, and generations yet to be born. And if we lose sight of that, if we allow ourselves to believe that we're the last campers in the campsite, we are going to pay a huge price as a society, and I think Doug has mentioned some of that. Does that mean that the more than doubling of expenses on the food stamp program, now called SNAP, over the past 6 years is without flaw? No, I think that the program needs to be looked at least around the edges. But it is responding to an expansion of human need. It's not just a question of questionable eligibility requirements or questionable administrative decisions. There is also an expansion of human need. I'll say one other thing, and that is that the Medicaid program is torn between two missions: dealing with the problems of poor people, especially poor children, and dealing with the problems of nursing homes. I'm in favor of decoupling those two missions, coming up with an insurance program for long-term care that gets Medicaid out of the business of long-term care entirely and allows it to focus on the single mission of dealing with poverty and disadvantage. And that would be, I think, immensely liberating on all sides.
Okay, last question, super speedy, because we've actually officially run out of time.
What kind of leadership, or how would you envision we could begin to solve these problems and have some of the solutions? You said there were 6 ideas to fix Social Security. What can be done? What can any of us do to try to go in that direction?
Okay, that is an excellent concluding question.
Terrific concluding question. And
perfect one, and I'm going
Okay.
to ask Bill first, and then Doug. Can you do sort of your 60-second answer?
my 60
What is the answer?
My 60-second answer will be an unpaid advertisement. I'm a co-founder of a national bipartisan group called No Labels, which you may have heard of. It is a national grassroots organization with 600,000 members, but we also have a congressional component. We have so-called congressional problem solvers, now numbering 78, evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans in the Congress of the United States, who are meeting regularly, breaking bread together, and coming up with bipartisan legislation that you will be hearing a lot more about in a couple of weeks. The long and the short of it is that as long as the country remains both deeply divided and closely divided, we cannot move forward unless we find a way of moving forward together. My party is not going to squash Doug's party, and Doug's party is not going to squash my party. So unless the Dougs and the Bills of this world can somehow get together and move forward together, we're going to be stuck where we are right now. So pay attention to organizations whose mission it is to get people to work together. That's my advice.
Okay, top that, Doug.
Pretty tough. I also run an organization called the Partnership for the Future of Medicare, which is a bipartisan thing I started with a guy named Ken Thorpe.
Oh, yeah. Good for you.
And, so there has to be a space for this, but that won't work, to be honest. The first thing we'll need is for our politicians who have the big megaphones and can do the public education that no matter how much Bill and I would like to, we just never will successfully do. They have to stop saying it's all fine. We've got to stop having political fights over throwing Granny over the cliff, for example, and somehow promising that Medicare is not going to change. It's going to change because it has to. And let's start talking about how to change it and have a fair debate about that instead of sticking our heads in the sand. And then the other thing we're going to need is very strong presidential leadership, because only the president is elected by every American. Only the president can say to Congress, this is a problem for the nation, go fix it, and thereby give them the political cover they need to actually do things they're afraid of. And only the president can go to his party and say, I know you don't like this. This is a bad vote. We will take care of you. We need your vote. Do this. And only the president can go to the other side and say, we know this is important to you. It has to stay in. And we need to get back to that kind of presidential leadership, or we're not going to fix any of these problems. And then I just want to conclude by saying he's wrong about the earned income tax credit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Bill and Doug for great conversation.